Poštovani gledaoci, dobrodošli u još jednu epizodu institutskih razgovora. Ja sam Ivona Leskur, istraživač-pripravnik na Institutu za evropske studije, a naš današnji gost je profesor dr. Bohumil Doboš. On nam dolazi sa Instituta za političke studije na Karlovom univerzitetu u Pragu. Profesor Doboš je pre svega politikolog i jako svestran naučnik i istraživač, bavi se raznim temama iz oblasti geopolitike, a mi ćemo se danas fokusirati na vrlo zanimljivu i specifičnu temu, a to je geopolitika svemira, odnosno астрополитика, sa fokusom na evropsku perspektivu. Razgovor će se nastaviti na engleskom, a bit će praćen prevodom na srpski jezik. So, Professor Doboš, welcome to our institute. It is really a pleasure to have you here, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation about geopolitics of space with you.
Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure.
So let's get started. Do you think we are witnessing a new space race? And if so, how does it differ from the Cold Era competition?
I wouldn't say that we see a repetition of the Cold War space race, because at that point, the only reason why the two superpowers were interested in promoting their space activities in a way they did was to highlight that they are more technologically advanced than the others. So we got to the point when, even though there were some very clear applications that were related to space domain and most importantly surveillance technologies, that later allowed for the signing of the first disarmament treaties in the early 70s, majority of the developments were there just for the show, to be first somewhere, be first there, irrespective of how much does it cost, with the Apollo funding being like 5% of the overall budget. Which is something we don't really see today. What we see today is sort of a contest over the practical applications that are used in our space, over the development of new counter-space technologies that will not spoil the environment in case of a conflict, the new services that can be provided may be more efficient, that provide a new service, etc. So even though we see that a lot of the actors are increasing their capacities, I don't think that we are witnessing something like in the 1960s.
Okay, and in the 1960s we had two major global actors in space race. How about now? Do we have some new emerging global powers in this space competition?
Yeah, so since the 1990s, we can observe that the United States is the undisputed leader in the development of space technologies. Even nowadays, with the rise of the others, still the US have the most holistic capacities, and if there is some innovation in a sense that a new service is being provided, like with Starlink, it comes from the US so far. However, some of the other actors are trying to catch up, which means mainly China and Europe, with China being comparatively stronger in the military applications, while Europe is stronger in the civilian applications of their space-based services, to the point when, for example, in case of Europe, we can speak about Galileo, which is much more precise navigational service compared to GPS, or Copernicus, which is a space surveillance monitoring system that again has much larger amount of applications compared to any other system. But looking at it holistically, still the US is at the top. Of course, we mustn't forget about Russia, but Russia is a space power in decline that still operates on the basic Soviet blueprints of their technology. We don't really observe a massive innovation, and the capacities to run the space program are actually decreasing. And then we need to mention some other actors that are trying to get involved, like India, like Japan, or some smaller actors like the United Arab Emirates, etc.
Mm-hmm. Okay, you mentioned Europe, so my next question is, where does Europe currently stand in this global race, this global competition, and is the EU lagging behind major space power?
So the European space program is one of the oldest ones we can find. France was the third state to independently launch a satellite to the orbit already at the beginning of the 1960s, so we can see that the origins of European space program are quite old. And given the technological sophistication we can find in Europe and the industrial potential, the European space program is quite well developed. The common European approach comes from the 1970s, when there were some attempts to unify the Western European space activities that were in the end unsuccessful. However, they later on merged into European Space Agency as we know it up until this point. And that basically was the starting point of the development of more sophisticated European-run space infrastructure. And at the same point, a limitation to what Europe is doing. Because on the one hand, European Space Agency was very efficient in the civilian applications and in space science. So if we look at the development of different instruments for space monitoring, etc., European Space Agency usually was there. If we look at the development of civilian infrastructure, European Space Agency was very much at the top of the development. However, on the other hand, what we have observed was that European Space Agency wasn't invested in the development of security and military related capabilities due to the fact that it's not an European Union agency. It's an independent organization. And as such, it could not get involved in the military application. So even though vast majority of the space infrastructure is dual use, it was developing it under the civilian cloud and running it only as a civilian infrastructure, not making the full potential of its military uses. And of course, it never invested in the counter space capabilities, which are also critical due to the fact that in the space environment, the offense trumps defense. We can easily break basically everything because of the large speeds in which the satellites are moving, because of their fragility due to the low capacity to launch stuff in the orbits. But it's extremely hard to defend them. So if there is an incoming missile, there is not much you can do. This is why it's important to have some deterrent, which lies in the development of counter space capabilities, which European Space Agency also cannot do. And for a long time, Europe was ignoring that because of the general environment. So there is no war in Europe, nothing will ever happen. We need to develop the civilian livelihoods, etc. Everything will be fine. However, in 2018, 2019, it became clear that this is no longer sustainable. And the first von der Leyen Commission set up the European Union Space Program Agency, which were suddenly able to deal with the security aspects as well, because it's the European Union agency. Since then, we run into the issue how to put this together, and the idea is that European Space Agency will construct the infrastructure, and then European Union Space Program Agency will run it. However, again, we can observe that it's not working perfectly because institutionally speaking, it's quite hard. But at least Europe started to deal with the military aspects as well, started to develop, for example, the IRIS² as the secure communication system. France started to develop some counter-space capabilities. They are planning to place some weapon-grade laser on the orbits, etc. in the upcoming years. So Europe is moving in this direction as well. So to answer your question, the European Space Program was well developed from the technological point of view. It was able to deploy extremely well-developed civilian applications, but it was very weak from the security and military point of view, and now is trying to catch up with the deterioration in this security environment in Europe in general.
That's what I wanted to ask you. So what is the main driving force? What is the main interest of European Union to invest in space technology? And what do common European citizens have out of those investments? Do they have any personal benefits?
Of course, there are a lot of benefits because the modern technological societies are heavily connected to the space infrastructure even without realizing that. For example, the banking system globally runs thanks to the GPS. Without the precise timing and navigation, the contactless payments wouldn't be available. So just this one example highlights how much our current way of life depends on space-based technology and their availability. There was a study a couple of years ago in the UK, and it assumed that if the just GPS stopped working, the US economy would be losing some tens of billions of pounds every day. So there is a huge dependency on this availability. So the one key reason why Europe needs to develop its autonomous infrastructure is that it can actually operate it. because being dependent on infrastructure run by someone else is extremely dangerous because it can be switched off. Also, it's important to start to invest in these security applications simply because of the threats that are coming against the European Union from different sides. So being able to protect these systems is important. This is why European Union got involved. And last but not least, there is another direct implication, and that are the so-called spin-offs. And the development of space infrastructure requires massive innovations in technology simply because the space environment is so harsh that you usually need to come up with new solutions. And all of these new solutions then can have additional applications here on Earth. So usually what is being argued is that if we look at it just from the economic point of view, the spin-off from the technology that was developed for space operations but finds another uses on the ground generates much more profit than what you invest into the development of the space technologies themselves. So even from this point of view, there is this direct impact on the citizens, not only of Europe, but globally, because a lot of the technologies we use on a daily basis have been developed thanks to these space applications, like, for example, the touchscreens. This is something that is developed thanks to that. Obviously, we all like to order stuff online, with usually tracking thanks to the availability of the navigational system. If there is an incoming bad weather or, let's say, like some natural catastrophe, we got much more precise information thanks to the space-based satellites, etc., etc. So there is a lot of applications. The modern society cannot operate without the space segment, and this is why it is critical for any actor that tries to develop its own strategic autonomy to also control its own space-based aspect.
And from geopolitical perspective, does Europe need to look for its allies in space competition, or is it the best to stay completely independent in investing in space technologies?
It cannot be completely independent. That's basically impossible because of the nature of the orbital movement and the price tag of these systems. Europe just needs to highlight which of these systems are critically important, because if you have a critical infrastructure, you want to have control over it. Then you have other systems that can be, for example, run on a commercial basis, private basis, or can be shared by your allies. And it really depends what you identify as these critical aspects. So definitely what is a critical infrastructure are the navigation systems. So Europe started to develop Galileo quite soon. What is the part of critical infrastructure are the launching services. So Europe developed its Ariane systems already in the 1980s, because these are the aspects that we really want, despite the fact that they might not be economically as viable as providing, for example, the commercial uses. So if I give an example, Europe can depend on the majority of its launches on SpaceX because it's cheaper, but it still needs to maintain its own capacity in case something goes wrong, so it can still manage its own space-based infrastructure. While with some other services that are not as critical, like civilian communications, civilian, the satellite TV, etc., it can be privatized, because if it stops working, it will be inconvenient, but it's not such big of an issue.
All right, that's from economical and political perspective. And when we have legal perspective in mind, does Europe, to be more precise, the European Union, does it have some specific normative and legal framework for regulating space activities?
So regarding the normative framework, this is extremely challenging, because outer space, as res communis, have its own space, its own international treaties that were passed in the 1960s that tried to challenge the differences between other environments and outer space. So we have the Outer Space Treaty, the Registration Treaty, Rescue Agreement, etc., which established some sort of a widely accepted international law that everyone should follow. The issue is that these treaties are by far not perfect. They are mostly normative, not legally binding, and there is no way how to change them to better respect the current realities, because currently The great powers do not agree on anything. US, Russia, China do not want to sign any new agreements, so this is not happening. This is why Europe tried to pursue the so-called European Code of Conduct in the beginning of the 21st century to establish these non-binding, common sense rule of law, rule of roads, and some basic norms that we would follow in relation, for example, to space traffic management. This is something that wasn't an issue throughout the Cold War because there was so little happening in our space that you really don't need any precise rules. If you are, for example, we can use an analogy that when you are living somewhere in the countryside and there are 3 cars in the whole village, you don't really take care that much about the rules that follow the traffic because there is a little chance that something will happen. If you go to a large town, if you don't have a very precise rules about how the cars should behave, it will be mayhem. The same logic went behind this code of conduct, so it will not be legally binding, but we will find some common ground among all of the actors, and then we will follow these rules just to make the space sustainable. The issue was that, again, this was in the end not passed because of the sanction regime that was established against Russia in a consequence of the annexation of Crimea, right at the time when this code of conduct should have been passed. However, the European countries and many others are following voluntarily anyway, because it's a common sense approach. Then each and every state is having its own regulatory mechanisms because only states are responsible for space operations. So if you are a private entity, you still need to register by some state. So each and every state has their own rules that the private operators, for example, need to follow. So obviously for Europe, there are some national laws. So far there isn't a common EU regulation on this sense, but there are some approaches. And then some of the European countries are also invested in some other modernizations of international law, for example, as a part of Artemis. So Artemis is the US-led project to return people to the moon this way sustainably. So we will have settlements there, and it should be a stepping stone to further development of the cislunar space for space mining, for possibly missions to Mars. And it's a wider collaborative project. So we can see some East Asian countries being present, Latin American countries, a lot of European countries, some Middle Eastern states, African states, etc. And as a part of the Artemis project, the so-called Artemis Accords were signed, and they provide some new legal principles related to the management of the settlements of the moon, lunar surface, because so far the international law is extremely vague, it's extremely problematic how to manage all of that. So there is this attempt to somehow modernize it. It's a controversial legal measure. However, it's at least some attempt to do it. So there are numerous aspects where Europe is active, but so far there is no unified new approach that would be held simply because for it to work, a wider set of actors needs to agree, because if you are the only one following it, and you have all of these satellites around and the others do not, then it's get a bit problematic.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned commercial private actors. Can you tell us a bit more about their relationship with state actors and government projects?
Yeah, that is also very interesting. So the push towards the commercialization is mainly felt in the US. It's the original is the original area from which this push towards the commercialization has arrived. It's a policy that we can observe being followed by all of the administrations since the first Obama administration. So it's one of the few things where the Democrats and Republicans actually agree upon. So the Obama policies were only followed and continued by Trump, by Biden, and now by Trump again. So this is something we see there. Europe is trying to also strengthen its commercial sector because obviously space is a huge market. It's one of the few markets that continue to grow even throughout the 2008-9 economic crisis, etc. So it's somewhere where a lot of money is, and actually the low Earth orbits are now so routinely visited that a lot of the private entities can do stuff there much more cheaply and efficiently than states. And then we have countries like Russia and China who are opposing that very voicefully. So there is this dispute, and obviously the case then lies in the fact how to regulate it, but more importantly, how much these private entities should be involved in dual-use systems, because a lot of the services that are relevant in times of crisis are fully commercialized, and we have seen this after February 2022 in Ukraine, because the Ukrainian state were allowed to use a lot of this private infrastructure to allow it to defend itself against the Russian invasion. And we have seen that this came with some positives and some negatives. So the positive was much more flexible. When the Starlink was sought after, there wasn't a large process to decide. Basically, Elon Musk decided, okay, I will provide it. It was there. However, on the other hand, we see some shortcomings, and that is that the same decision can come, I will not provide it anymore, which also happened to Starlink. This is why currently Europe is, for example, working on its own similar constellation called Eutelsat, and this is why, for example, Taiwanese are investing, because they do not trust that Starlink would be available in case of crisis because of the dealings of Elon Musk with China. So they are investing in this European application because they trust it more. And then there is another aspect, and that is the security of these systems, because the states generally pay more attention to securing the availability of the system. So ramping up the protection of the electronic signals, cybersecurity, and all of these aspects. Private entities quite often do not pay attention to that because it costs a lot of money. And we have seen that different private actors are approaching it differently again in Ukraine, when both Starlink and Viasat were attacked. And Viasat are reconnaissance satellites that were sending a lot of these images prior to the invasion about the movements of the Russian troops. And both of these were attacked. Viasat were basically shut down because they weren't sufficiently protected against cyber attacks, while Starlink was much better prepared, and it never ceased to work over Ukraine for a protracted period of time. Obviously, it's not working continuously, but that's the case with GPS, for example, as well. So it's often being jammed over mainly Eastern Europe. So over Poland, we have a lot of incidents like that, over the Baltic states. When the Foreign Lion plane was landing, I believe, in Bucharest, it was also jammed. So this is something that is happening, but it can be restarted quite swiftly. With the private solutions, sometimes it's an issue, and how to establish this framework so states can reliably be dependent on these systems is a question that is now being solved.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned mining minerals and resources on the moon surface. So what countries are the most interested in obtaining those resources, and how does that change geopolitical landscape?
So the mining on the lunar surface will probably not be that impactful because the lunar composition is very similar to Earth. However, what is being promoted as a possible way forward is to use the moon as a stepping stone to mine the near-Earth asteroids, because they are passing quite near, and from the lunar surface, from the low gravity, you can reach them much easier. And actually, what is important about the near-Earth asteroids is that some of them are having large concentrations of rare earth minerals, which would be a game changer, because it's being assumed that, for example, with the case of some of the minerals that are necessary for the green transition, for the modern electronics, etc., just one of the correctly identified asteroid can have more of these minerals than are now the known reserves on Earth because of their spread, etc. So, for example, all of the issues regarding mining in the Eastern DRC, which is the key issue about the security in Central Africa. So there is a lot of cobalt, coltan present in Eastern Congo, so there are conflicts over it. Then there is the issue about sustainability, about normative aspects, etc. If we are able to correctly pinpoint one of the asteroids with sufficient amount of these minerals, this wouldn't be an issue on Earth in our lifetimes by far, because the concentrations are really large. The issue is then to correctly pinpoint it and to develop the capacity to mine it. However, it's being assumed by the optimists that we will see this happening in the next 10, 15 years. By the pessimists, the deadlines are a bit further away. It all depends on how viable this is perceived. But Couple of the countries already allowed it because according to the international law, it's unclear whether you can or cannot mine for commercial purposes. So US, Luxembourg, Japan, and United Arab Emirates already set up their national laws that allow for the commercial space mining to become the hubs of this activity for the future, because then the amount of taxes they would be able to generate would be enormous.
But even if it happens in the near future, do you really believe that the overall humanity would benefit of it? Or would the game between the main capitalist actors transit to outer space from the Earth?
This depends how you define benefit, because if hypothetically in the 15 years we have found an asteroid with a mineral that would solve issue of one of these minerals, then directly it would be the one actor that mined it that benefits from it financially the most. On the other hand, the fact that you don't have to compete over these usually impoverished regions may improve their situation well, just because the great powers stop caring and they leave them alone. So this might be just a small benefit that this fighting stops because no one really cares and it can start to develop, and the great powers are not involved in carving it up and just tearing out the minerals, which usually deteriorates the situation. Also, the general decrease in the prices of these minerals might lead to decrease of the prices of the technologies we built upon that. So, for example, if we think about the protection of the environment, of the climate, of promotion of accessibility to electricity, for example, if these technologies are super cheap because the materials are cheap, then they can spread wider. So the developing states might not pollute their environment because suddenly they will have these green technologies available that suddenly will be achievable for them for a price that might improve their situation. But I would agree with you that the direct economic benefit would lie with the state that mines this potential source.
Mm-hmm. And you've already mentioned that some space technologies serve both social and commercial purposes, but also have some clear military or strategic applications. So how should we understand this dual use dilemma in the European context?
That's probably the biggest issue of space security, that like 90-95% of all systems can be used for military and civilian uses at the same time, and they can be differentiated just by the intent, which creates a huge issue regarding some sort of regulations, because if you cannot define what you are regulating, you are not regulating nothing. That goes to space weapon, that goes to any other aspect. In case of Europe, the issue was that European Space Agency couldn't deal with military aspects, so it basically ran everything under the civilian administration. And even though there was a clear security implication, it wasn't publicly highlighted. It wasn't used to its fullest potential. So Europe, first of all, pretended it's not there. And second of all, when it used it only in minimal sense because it wanted to pretend it's not happening. With the deterioration of the security environment and the setting up of EUSPA, this is luckily changing. So Europe is suddenly able to more fully embrace even these security applications, which are critical for maintenance of strategic autonomy in Europe. If we aren't able to use our own infrastructure for securing the environment around us, then it's our own fault. And the dual use nature will be there, irrespective whether we think about it or not. We can see some other possible ways forward in the world. So, for example, in the US, there is this division between the armed forces and NASA, civilian armed. So you can quietly see it. In China, they don't say anything. So you don't know. Europe tried to find a third way. So we will try to make everything civilian, which wasn't sustainable. So now we can find something similar to the US. So we have EUSPA, which can do security stuff, ESA, which is purely civilian.
All right, Professor, that was all for today. Thank you really for this insightful conversation. I enjoyed it and I hope you did too.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Dragi gledaoci, ovo je kraj epizode. Nadamo se da ste uživali u ovom razgovoru, a vi nastavite da pratite naše aktivnosti kao i naredne epizode institutskih razgovora. Perfect.